Okay, so welcome back uh, to the Symposium on Climate Justice in Cities. We're thrilled to be welcoming Professor Julian Agyeman, who's a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at University. Professor Agyeman is the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He centers his research on critical explorations of the complex and embedded relations between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by governments or social movement organizations, and looks also at their effects on public policy and planning processes and outcomes, particularly in relation to notions of justice and equity. Dr. Agyeman believes that what our cities can become, sustainable, smart, sharing, and resilient, and who is allowed to belong in them, recognition of diversity, difference, and a right to the city, are fundamentally and inextricably interlinked. We must therefore act on both belonging and becoming together, using just sustainabilities as the anchor, or we will face deepening spatial and social inequities and inequalities. Professor Agyeman is the author or editor of 13 books, including Just Sustainabilities, Cultivating Food Justice, and Sharing Cities. I have to note also that Professor Agyeman published my first book, for which I am eternally grateful, on sustainable regional planning. In 2018, he was awarded by the Athena City Accolade by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. And in 2021, he became the Fletcher Professor of Rhetoric and Debate, an endowed chair at Tufts University. He has served as an advisor on Mayor Michelle Wu's transition team when she was becoming the mayor of Boston. And with that, I will cede the mic. Thank you so much for coming down.
So apparently I'm wearing a Canadian tuxedo. Who knew? Who knew? Okay. So I want to start this talk really by emphasizing the word that Karen mentioned, belonging. Belonging is going to be what I'm going to be talking about, because I've got this idea really that what we're talking about, what we've been talking about this morning, is what our cities can become, and they need to become different. But we often forget who gets to belong in our cities, because those who we disbelong aren't going to participate in our cities. Are we just going to dream about elite becomings of cities, or are we going to have cities where people get to belong and the cities get to become something different because we have a different concept of belonging? So I want to start with actually a video, and this is from a Canadian First Nations organization who are not still around, but it really asks this question about belonging, and I want you to just take a look.
What does belonging look like if nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the parks, buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome there? The Indigenous Placemaking Council seeks to restore Indigenous presence to Canadian cities, towns, and communities.
What does belonging look like if you can't see yourself in the spaces of the city? What does it look like? Now, actually, in Canada, you do a much better job. I mean, living in Boston, there is no evidence of the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc. They have been erased from the cityscapes. The only presence is the derisory presence on the Massachusetts state flag of a sachem, which is a leader. And that's going to be soon because we're taking things that depict Indigenous people in ways that are colonialist, we're taking them away. So what does belonging look like? I want you to hold that thought as I go through the rest of my talk. So let me just start then with a little bit of history about just sustainabilities. So it's 20 years since we published this book. And this was the first book that looked at equity and social justice as central. How many books on sustainability have you looked at? And there's a chapter on equity and justice. And you know what? Often I've written it. I don't do it anymore. I'm not going to write for books where equity and justice is compartmentalized in a chapter. I want to see it as a cross theme across sustainability. So really what we were looking at, entering equity and social justice, we were looking at the links between environmental quality and human equality. And 20 years ago, remember, environmental quality, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, human equality, people like Amnesty International, they weren't talking. We were siloed. How was it that we were siloed in that way? In the global south, not much. I mean, you think about the Amazon, you think about the Congo, you think about the Kamchatka Peninsula, wherever in the world environmental degradation is happening, it's always related to issues of social injustice and human rights infringements. Show me an environmental project degradation that doesn't affect human life in some way. So we were arguing that sustainability cannot simply be a green or environmental concern, important though those aspects are, but that a truly sustainable society was one where wider questions of social need, social welfare, economic opportunity are integrally related to the environmental limits imposed by supporting systems. Now, I'm an academic. I don't usually promote other people's books, but I want you to take a look at this book, 2009. This book was written by two British academics, and they got 40 years of comparable data from across the world. And here's the headline. It's not poverty. Poverty is bad. It's not the big corrosion. Inequality is the big killer. Inequality, the gap between rich and poor. And the book shows conclusively and in a very readable way that the bigger the gap between rich and poor in nations, the more social malaise, from domestic violence, alcoholism, drug abuse, teen pregnancies, high school dropouts, you name it, it increases with increasing social inequality. But what they also looked at was, and how they ever thought about this, they looked at advertising revenues, and they found quite a strong correlation between increasing inequality and increasing advertising revenues. Because, as I highlighted there, inequality heightens competitive competition. The poor want to get into the middle class, the middle into the upper middle class, the upper middle into the rich into the super rich into the, oh my God, I'm Jeff Bezos class. We're on an escalator, an elevator of consumption. What does that drive? That drives our carbon footprint. The book makes the point that greater inequality tend to have higher carbon footprints. How often do we start to think about that? All we hear about is we need sustainable transportation. Yes, we do. Sustainable agriculture. Yes, we do. But what we need to look at is what are the drivers of climate change? And a big one is growing inequality. So if we really want to understand sustainability, it should be on both human equality and environmental quality together, not separately. So if we're looking to define just sustainabilities, it's the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. 4 conditions here. We must commit to improving people's life and well-being. We must commit to meeting the needs of both the present and future generations. We must commit to justice and equity, not just in terms of process and procedure, which most legal systems guarantee some form of process and procedural justice. Whether it works or not is another matter. But what I want you to focus on is the first word there, recognition. This is an often forgotten idea. This is Iris Marion Young, the late Iris Marion Young's idea, developed by people like Barbara Nussbaum. But this idea of recognition is, if we don't recognize the rights to be of people or groups, then how can we ever do justice by them? How can we ever reconcile and further down the line look at reparations? What is the biggest call at the moment for recognition? What's the biggest cry? 3 letters, hashtag. BLM, Black Lives Matter. It's the single biggest cry, and it's grown louder in the 2010 to 2020 period for obvious reasons, certainly in the United States, but it's been exported. You know, they've been toppling statues. Edward Colston in Bristol, England, in Sydney, Australia. The Black Lives Matter recognition movement has really captured young people a lot. Me Too, the cries for Indigenous rights. Recognition is fundamental, I think, a fundamental precursor in many ways to justice. And then all of these 3 conditions must be done within ecosystem limits, the so-called one planet living principle. A little pat on the back for myself here. Just Sustainabilities both underlies and predates the fantastic work that Kate Raworth has done, fantastic work on donor economics. She's even bringing it down to the city level now, Amsterdam, Portland, or Philadelphia, looking at using the donut. Why she called it a donut? Why not a whole wheat bagel? Donut doesn't sound very sustainable or ecological to me. So the whole wheat bagel economics, I'm going to call it. But if you look at her chart there, it is just sustainabilities. We mustn't transgress the mental or ecological ceiling, but we mustn't let people fall below the social foundation. So her safe and just space for humanity is my just sustainabilities. That's what it is. And I've let her know she should have put it in there, but whatever. The Sustainable Development Goals. Look, I remember back in 1992 when sustainability hit the big in Rio, the Rio Earth Summit. It was still a focus on environmental sustainability then. So I want to commend the UN for really moving a long way with the Sustainable Development Goals, which fully embody issues of race, gender, sexuality, voice, etc., etc. So I'm going to move a little bit into urban planning before I give you 3 examples of just sustainabilities. What is urban planning? I think the most elegant and simple way of defining it is from Patsy Healy, Emeritus Professor at Newcastle University in the UK, managing our coexistence in shared space. What an elegant and simple way of looking at urban planning. Managing our coexistence in shared space. And just think, it would be easy to manage our coexistence, well, easier to manage our coexistence in shared space if we all did the same thing. We all ate alike, prayed alike, made love the same. If we were all the same, it would be easier. But we live in cities of difference, cities where we're constantly in the presence of the other. How do we coexist in shared space? And how does urban planners create the conditions where people can coexist in shared spaces? We're not doing a brilliant job at that. We need to think more about it. Second point, there is a brilliant young PhD student. He's just got a job now at the University of Pittsburgh, Rashad Williams, who wrote a seminal paper. This paper is going to become really important about moving from racial planning to reparative. In the US, as you know, urban planning, and I'll say this in my case studies, urban planning is the spatial toolkit of white supremacy, period. Segregation was the objective of urban planning, period. That's not woke, that's fact, historical fact. But Rashad is arguing that we need to move from this racial plan, this segregationist planning, the production of racialized spaces, which has gone on in the United States, towards a reparative planning, a normative call for the field to embrace reparations via reparative planning. What would that look like? Look, we don't have examples at the moment. We've got Providence, Rhode Island. We've got Evanston, Illinois. We've got several cities looking at what reparations might look like. Evanston, Illinois is doing it through housing policy. But I want to see parks policy, housing policy, transportation. I want to see it across planning such that the main goal of US urban planning becomes reparative urban planning. And, you know, it may well apply to Canada as well. But I'm not sure that in Canada has been as directly racialized as it has in the United States. Going back to this notion of belonging and becoming, what is the relationship? Do we understand the relationship between belonging and becoming? Again, planners, we're always dreamers. Ebenezer Howard, all the great planners. We don't remember any of the names of the technical planners, but the dreamers we remember because they've given us these amazing visions. And we must never stop dreaming, but we must recognize that we are disbelonging, we are actively disbelonging people along the way. And that's not good. That's not a right to the city. And then finally, a little sort of semantic point. The Congress for New Urbanism in the US, and I'm sure some of your Canadian authorities, are always talking about human scale planning. Great, good. But I want you to put an E on the word human. I want humane scale planning. Planning that facilitates our coexistence in shared space, that inculcates empathy. Planning that is focused on increasing human dignity. Because you know what, certainly in the United States, a lot of our planning and policy decreases human dignity. And I'm going to go on to show you how that happens and why. So I'm going to give 3 examples then of just sustainabilities in policy planning and practice. One is the idea of spatial justice. How do we allocate rights to spaces and places in cities? Second is what I call the Minneapolis books. How does the second most green city in the US, after Portland, Oregon, and one of the most liberal cities end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? How is that? We were all told green would give us social justice. Not so much. And a couple of people addressed this point about greening, obvious links with increased social justice. In fact, sometimes the opposite is the case. There's a decrease in social justice in greening situations. And then I want to finish up by looking at food justice and taking a pot shot at this idea of what is local. What's local anymore in intercultural societies? If immigrants want to eat foods from their own countries and they grow in our areas, what is local food? Who gets to say what local food is? So let's start with this idea of spatial justice. Not many cities in the world have walls anymore. Jerusalem, Belfast, Nicosia, Cyprus, but most cities don't have walls. And the idea of social justice is that, you know, social justice says life chances shouldn't be distributed along race, ethnic, gender lines, socioeconomic lines. Spatial justice says opportunity shouldn't be distributed geographically. Yet we just got a report in the Boston Globe the other day that Beacon Hill, the old brick part of Boston, you live 20 years longer than people in Roxbury, 1.5 miles away. Your zip code is more important than your genetic code. And this has been shown in St. Louis, across the Del Mar Boulevard. It's been shown in so many cities. How is it that our zip code is more important than our genetic code? I want to just go back on this one because it's an important point. So if I were in the US, I would say, okay, who grew up in a town with a river, a rail track, a freeway, or some other delineating feature? And they lived on one side of the tracks and you lived on the other. Usually about 30% of the audience have grown up in those spaces. We don't need walls. We use landscape features or infrastructural features to segregate and to sort and to classify. Now, let's bring this down to the level of the street, this idea of spatial justice, because I think we can think about streets as, number one, the public space that we use every single day. We don't always go to parks, but we always use streets. And here's 2 streets, same width. One is Massachusetts Avenue on the right in Cambridge, where the crane there is. That's when they were just building the new part of Harvard Law School. And on the left is Söderwegen in Gothenburg. 2 streets, 2 countries, couldn't be more differently spatially arranged. The streets are identical in width. On Söderwegen, to the left of the streetcar, is the part of the street that private vehicles can travel on. The Swedes have imposed spatial justice on the street, or they've democratized the street. Massachusetts Avenue, not so much. You can see here the principle of access to space. It's A, having a vehicle, and B, the size of your vehicle. And the FedEx, that takes more than the car next to it. So a vehicle and its size is basically a principle for allocating rights to space on American streets. But what I wonder is, see the blocks of apartments there, the kids going to school every day. One kid sees in the United States, and this is Cambridge, this is liberal Cambridge, Massachusetts, getting out of bed and going to school on Massachusetts Avenue. How is he, she, they wired differently to the kid on Söderwegen going to school who sees spatial order, who sees no difference between a person in a car and a person walking or cycling? Now, we got data on this. This was some work done in San Francisco in the early 80s by the late Don Appleyard. And basically what you can see here is social interaction is affected by the amount of traffic on streets. On the right, we have a lightly trafficked street with a lot more social interaction and friendships across the street. On the left, we have the heavily trafficked street, not so much social interaction nor friendships. Somebody's going to say, well, what's the just sustainability's take? Who lives on the streets on the right-hand side and who lives on the streets on the left-hand side? Whose kids are more likely to be killed on those heavily trafficked streets, whether they're cyclists, walkers, they're Asian American kids, they're African American kids, they're Latin American kids, who suffer much more pedestrian and cycle fatalities than white kids, largely because of the streetscapes that they encounter. So again, spatial justice, the design of our streets, these are all things I think we need to think about when we're thinking about climate change. I mean, it's all going on up there, but we need to think about how do we enact just sustainability strategies at the local. Now, it's not all bad news here in the US. It's not all bad news down south of the border. One good thing Mayor Bloomberg did was to really look at streets in New York. He hired Janet Sadiq Khan, the transportation commissioner. She brought Jan Gehl, the iconic Danish architect behind the Copenhagen miracle. And really, this is what they came up with. And the picture on the top left was Times Square before they'd made all the changes. And on the bottom right is Broadway, just outside of Macy's. These are people streets. These are streets for people. Now, obviously, we can't have every street in a city looking like Broadway does outside Macy's, but we could have a substandard that could be changed. And there's no better example than Copenhagen, which has, per capita, the biggest area of pedestrianized city space. And the Danes weren't always for it. In the early 60s, they said, what are you doing? We're not Italians. It's cold up here. We want to, no, they did say that. It's cold up here. We want to go in our car. In Amsterdam too. It's not, don't get it that the Europeans are, they've got a gene for sustainability. What they've got is more options to be sustainable. They have as many cars as Americans. They just don't use them as much because the interurban options are there. Now, I did say as well, we're very good at disbelonging people through this concept of hostile and defensive architecture and urban design. And let me just take you through some of these pictures. Top left, we all know what that is, stopping kids skateboarding. We don't want kids up on the edges. So some designer decided to put those studs there to stop kids skateboarding. Top center, despite the fact that the bench is nicely colored in the LGBTQIA colors, there are armrests. not for your benefit, but to stop homeless people sleeping. Even more insidious, top right, some architect or urban designer made to put studs on a building to stop homeless people sleeping there. Look, I've been to stations and there's those spikes to stop the pigeons landing. What's the difference between those and this? What was I calling for? Humane urban planning? Planning for human dignity? This is not dignified. This is not acceptable in the 21st century, nor is, bottom right, the rich door, poor door problem. Big cities, and I'm sure it's the case in Toronto, it is in London, Vancouver, Boston. Developers, when they're developing big projects, usually have to develop a certain amount of affordable units. But the more cynical architects, in collusion, obviously, with the cities who permit these, are putting poor doors around the back. Doors where the people in the affordable units go, and then the rich come in their cars along the boulevards, cars get valeted, they scoot up to the penthouse suites. This is the 21st century and we're doing this. In London, there was a scandal 2 years ago where a new development had gardens. One was really nice for the full fare paying people, and then for the, for the subsidized people, there was a little yard. I mean, this is the 21st century. The final one I want to show you is the underpass there. Now that's in Seattle. And you can see there are bike racks. So there was a homeless encampment and the city thought, we're going to move people on. Let's use sustainability. Nobody's going to disagree if we use sustainability. Let's put bike racks there. Well, the biking community of Seattle said, not on our watch. We've got a problem with homelessness. It needs policy, resources, planning, not aggressive action using bike infrastructure. So these are just some of the ways we belonging in cities, just some of the ways, and there are many, many, many more. Somebody was mentioning freeways earlier. I just put this in because it is a big issue at the moment. The Biden-Buttigieg plan called Reconnecting Communities. Removing urban highways can improve neighborhoods blighted by decades of racist policies. Any GIS, just pull up any US city, overlay the demographic data, then overlay the roads, and you'll notice something consistently across US cities. The freeways were used to bust up communities, and this one is between West Oakland and downtown Oakland. But as somebody mentioned, the problem is, yeah, we can take these down. What do we replace them with? If we replace them with parks and amenities, we're likely to get gentrification on steroids. Now, I don't have time to go into all the anti-gentrification tools, but I just will say one thing. David Harvey, the great geographer, probably the greatest living geographer, said, we're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in. That's the problem. And until that changes, all of our anti-gentrification strategies are band-aids. We're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in. That's a big, big, big problem. Excuse me. Now, a colleague of mine at Yale, Elijah Anderson, has come up with this concept of the cosmopolitan canopy. And his contention is basically we walk along streets studiously trying to get in people's faces or look at them. We don't want to look at people. But that there are places in cities, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies, where we sit down and we are almost at ease with difference, with otherness. This cosmopolitan canopy here on his book is the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. Food spaces are good like this. People sit down, they eat different ethnic food, they chat, they watch a ball game. It's as if there's no barriers. Cosmopolitan canopies, I think, are a very interesting concept. And I wonder, is there a role for us, for me, as planner, urban designers, can we create cosmopolitan canopies? Can we create these spaces of engagement where people come together across difference and talk? Kids' spaces are good. You can see here, the kids just play. They don't notice difference. And the parents then sit around and talk. These are really, really important spaces. Food spaces, kid spaces, and as a dog owner of 5 years, dog spaces, dog parks, great places for meeting people across difference. You talk about the dogs. We need more spaces of engagement. Now, Couple of number one, these cosmopolitan canopies are not going to be an end to racism, but they do perform what is called contact theory. Contact theory says the more opportunities you have to be in the presence of people who are different from you, the more likely you are to be tolerant and respectful and even desirous of more integrationist. I don't like that word integrationist because it's got bad connotations, but I can't think of another word at the moment. Contact theory is really important. And we as urban planners, we in the sustainability world, need to think about the implications of contact theory. Are we creating spaces where people can meet across difference? And often we're not, is the answer. Now, another tried and tested idea to try and combat this idea of spatial injustice is complete streets. And you'll notice on the right, it may not still be the Toronto Complete Streets Manual. The other ones are from Massachusetts, from Swampscott, from Somerville. This idea of complete streets is about decentering the automobile and recentering humans and transportation, biking, walking. But again, being a critical urban planner, I ask about complete streets. Who gets to say what a complete street is? And will these complete streets neighborhoods growing into bigger neighborhoods, this greenlining of the city, if you like, and I'll come back to that phrase, this greenlining of the city into these neighborhoods, is that going to bring us more just and equal city? Or will it just result in enhanced livability for the most privileged residents who can afford to live in those places? Again, coming back to with my critical hat on, what is a complete street? Now, many of the people who get involved in this are urban designers. They are physical designers. They're not anthropologists, they're not sociologists. And Doreen Massey, the late great geographer Doreen Massey, sees places, and streets are places, as having no fixed meaning. What she says is that these places, these streets, are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. But most of our urban design, complete streets practice is devoid thinking about community anthropology, the social ecology of the street. And what this does is it cuts streets off from their significant social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and historical realities. And the two pictures, look, one on the right is a design for a complete street. On the left, a street in Athens, Greece. We can't design that. We can't program that. That happens because of this social ecology, because of contact theory, because of mixing of different groups of people. That's the wonder in many ways of the city. And just to give you an even more extreme example, Los Angeles, I was there a couple of weeks ago. Los Angeles has a complete streets policy, and it's doing quite a lot of work on it at the moment. But until very recently, it banned street vending. What are the two biggest, I don't even want to call them minority communities because they are possibly majority communities in LA, Southeast Asian and Latin American. Who's been to a Latin American city where there's no street vending, or a Southeast Asian city where there's no street vending? It's part of the culture. How can LA say it's got a complete streets policy if it doesn't allow street vending? It does now because of a lot of protests, and it permits street vending. But you can see what I'm saying here. Who gets to say what a complete street is if you're leaving out the cultural proclivities of two huge groups within your city? Another book opportunity here, folks. And this book series that Karen's book is in, she was actually the second after my book, Incomplete Streets. You see how the critical academic plays with phrases, incomplete streets rather than complete streets. So again, I'm not against the concept. I just want to know who gets to say, is there enough consultation about what a complete street is? Now, the book on the right, Green Gentrification, really makes the case that we are greenlining neighborhoods. These complete streets projects are coalescing so that we're getting complete streets neighborhoods, and we are in effect greenlining neighborhoods. Now, we all know that redlining was explicitly racist, and it was about delineating cities in the 40s and 50s, neighborhoods that were largely black, graded them as D or hazardous, and they got no funding, government or otherwise. green gentrification, greenlining is not explicitly racist, but it's about money. It costs a lot of money to live in these complete streets neighborhoods. And who's got the money? Who's disproportionately in control of the money? Boston Globe recently showed that the average net worth of a white family in Boston is $247,000. The average net worth of an African American family is $8. Who gets to live in these neighborhoods is really important. So what we're doing is, as the book says, greening whitens neighborhoods. So I'm making in the text here is that a lot of these plans are systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial, and social inequalities and injustices that have dominated US cities in the last 100 years or so. I would argue that the key metric, the key urban sustainability metric is walkability. How walkable is your neighborhood on a score from 0 to 100? Walk Score is an app, because there's an app for everything, even an app for giving up apps now, apparently. But Walk Score is a very interesting measure. It's not perfect, but it does give you an idea of the walkability of your neighborhood. And I guarantee if you're in a 90 plus, your realtor is using that statistic to up the value of your home or the rent. Who owns the app? Redfin, the internet realty giant. Let's just take a moment here. We have compromised and commodified sustainability to the point now where the key urban sustainability metric, it's owned by a realty company. That should stagger you. This should, in fact, let's all just do a big intake of breath. Yeah, it should make us stagger, because in the US, I mean, look, I want everybody to have complete streets, every neighborhood, and somebody made this point on the panels. But the way we're doing it is we're making it, a consumer item. Whether you live in these neighborhoods or not is now a consumer item. Just shifting quickly to parks. Again, this book, I'm an academic, it's not mine, but I want you to read it. Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity. Not biodiversity, cultural diversity. And the headline in this book is that in the 21st century, we're facing a different kind of threat to public space, not one of disuse, but of patterns of design and management that exclude some people and reduce social and cultural diversity. Now, I would say it's design, management, and programming. Okay, parks go through these: design of the park, the management, and the programming. What if we co-produced parks between communities and the city? What about co-production of these spaces? If any of you have got a moment, take a look at Chicano Park in San Diego, which I don't know much about it, but I was there and it is stunning. It's these sort of overpasses, but it's clearly looked after by the local Chicano community. It is spotless. There's votive candles. On the uprights, people have painted murals. It's a beautiful space. I cannot believe the city did it. The city wouldn't do that. This is the community, perhaps in cahoots. So I just want you to think about co-produced urban space. No need for police. No need for police. These are socially policed by the community because they're proud of these spaces. So we have a new mayor in Boston, Mayor Wu. I think she's doing an extremely good job. She's doing a load of things that people said you could never do, like 3 free buses from the poorest neighborhoods in Boston to downtown. Everybody said, you're nuts. Now every city and town in Massachusetts wants that. Progressive visionary leadership works, and long may it continue to do that. But we do have an issue. So this is Boston Common. This is the Boston Garden, which is next to Boston Common. These beautiful spaces designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and the Friends of the Park organizations are interesting. Boston is now a majority minority city. And yet looking at the Friends of Boston Common, you wouldn't notice that. These are elderly, white, super empowered, super wealthy people. What happens when a city's politics shifts on so that those, old white folks are not the power brokers anymore, the political power brokers, but they're the money brokers. They're the people who can bring in money. So the question that's being asked in this paper, Immigrant Engagement in Public Open Space, Strategies for the New Book, is what happens when the demographics and politics of a city changes? How will Olmsted's legacy be looked at by the new Bostonians? It's just like, Massachusetts Audubon Society, the Birds Nature Society. They don't know what the new Brazilian, Syrian, all the new Massachusetts who will be in the majority in 2050, what do they think of nature conservation? Will Massachusetts Audubon Society even be around if they don't think about what the new Massachusetts residents see as nature conservation? So I think it's just a really important point there. Now, I want to get back to this idea of engagement and belonging. So I've got this idea of landscape links. People say, I've observed this over about 40 years in the UK and the US, people gravitate to environments that are familiar to them. I think one of the reasons that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park because it looks like home. People gravitate to spaces and places that are here. Hold that thought, because I'm going to develop that in relation to food as well. Now, in Copenhagen, they've tried designing in encounter. This is an amazing park, Superkilen Park in Nørrebro, Copenhagen, which is a very large immigrant neighborhood. And so what they've done in this little park with a cycle path down the middle, go figure, it's Copenhagen. What they've done is they've worked with the community to put artifacts from different cultures into the park to give a sense of familiarity and also talking points. Somebody might say, is that from your culture? What is that? How do you use that? What do you do with that? So again, designing in encounter is another way of looking at developing this idea of contact theory. I have to give a shout out to my good friends at the University of Sheffield in England, the oldest department of landscape in the UK. And there's a transnational urban outdoors research group there. And one of their key points is this idea of deep ethnographies. Look, what data do we use as urban planners, as city planners? We use demographic data a lot to think about neighborhoods. I mean, demographic data somehow colors our vision of neighborhoods. But what does demographic data tell us? It just tells us percentages from groups within society. What we need is deep ethnographic data. And what better process than a co-production process? What if Toronto City Council entered into, agreements with different wards, different areas to develop deep ethnographies that could be used, updated, used, and accessible to city workers, to etc. Wouldn't it be a good project to work on? And they published a paper around that work in my journal, Local Environment, the International Journal of Justice and Sustainability, called Ethnographic Understandings of Ethnically Diverse Neighborhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. We can use ethnographic information to come up with better urban designs, especially when we co-produce those with communities. Okay, moving swiftly on to my second case, urban planning as a tool of white supremacy, the other lesson from Minneapolis. And Minneapolis, the best park system in the US. It's a fantastic city. It's a very attractive city. One of the best cities in the US for exercise. Third most bike commuters. Affordable, lots of opportunity. Minneapolis is a green utopia. That's if you're white. If you're not white, it's not such a nice place to be. Racial inequality in Minneapolis is amongst in the nation. The black-white home gap is right up there. But more tellingly, the black-white home ownership gap, the wealth gap, is the second highest, only to, I think, to Milwaukee. The achievement or opportunity gap in schools is huge. So, as you can imagine, Minneapolis is a paradox. We were all green cities, were fair cities, just cities. Not the case. Social justice does not mean, sorry, greening does not mean social justice. So I was going to call this slide Minneapolis WTF, but I thought, no, I thought this audience, no, these are good people. Let's just use why. So, so I spoke to Kirsten Delegard, who's a very interesting woman, and you must visit this project called Mapping Prejudice. She's been looking at racialized covenants in Minneapolis, and she said all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures more dark truths about the city. And what are those dark truths? Okay, 1900, Minneapolis growing, and it had a small but well-distributed African-American population. In 1910, racialized covenants started happening. By 1930, 20 years of racialized covenants, you had the emergence of Black North Minneapolis and the Black community in South Minneapolis. You also had city zoning, which followed the outlawing of racialized zoning by the Supreme Court in 1917. And now 70% of land in Minneapolis is single-family zoned, exclusionary zoning. There's even what has been called a racial cordon around these parks. The racial cordon is single-family zoned homes, so that basically are, not white and obviously don't come from one of these. You could be picked up by the cops. You might just be going to the park, but questions will be asked. I don't know whether there were Karens back in those days, but I'm sure there were Karens back in those days. And then redlining, redlining did a number. Now, each of these, single family zoning and redlining, very effective. But imagine the synergistic effects, the cumulative effects of those segregationist, white supremacist policies. And it equals racial segregation then and now. There's only one country on earth that's done it better than the US, and that was apartheid South Africa, where you actually needed a pass to get between different zones. So what is Minneapolis doing? Well, there's an acknowledgement by the Director of Long Range Planning that there's a direct link between all that I've just said and what Minneapolis looks like now. And incidentally, just on George Floyd, 93% of Minneapolis policers don't live in Minneapolis. In Boston, it's a requirement for employment by the city that you live in the city. I'm not saying Boston police officers are the world's greatest, but what I'm saying is, imagine a de-escalation situation and a young cop sees a kid and thinks, he went to school with my brother. That opportunity for human and humane isn't there for Minneapolis cops. They're all from the suburbs. They don't understand what's going on in the city. So again, zoning, racial segregation, perhaps as part of the story, the big backstory behind the murder of George Floyd. Urban planning, then, I put it to you, is the toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So what is Minneapolis doing about it? Well, the Minneapolis 2040 plan, number one, put an end to single-family zoning, and now you can have duplexes and triplexes on single-family lots. They've got inclusionary zoning policies. Look at goal number one on the left, eliminate disparities. In 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. Ambitious, but then it needs an ambitious plan. There are 39 policies pursuant to goal number one. Environmental justice and green zones, park design and programming, you notice there, freeway remediation. So the city is thinking about how to really come to terms with these deep inequalities that are a century, well, many centuries, but in terms of urban planning, probably about a century and a half. Okay, realizing that my time is coming up, This is another book opportunity, Cultivating Food Justice. This book came out in 2011. The psychologists tell me if I leave this on for 45 seconds, 20% of you will be on Amazon buying it. So let me just make sure I get the timing right. I got to try and sell books somehow, folks. Come on. So let me just jump right in with a story here. So I was listening to National Public Radio 2011, and this fascinating segment came on about George, now sadly the late George, and his wife Julia Bowling, two tobacco farmers in Maryland. And the state of Maryland is trying to get the farmers out of tobacco and into other crops. And being good American farming entrepreneurs, Julia and George are thinking, what are we gonna grow? And somebody said, well, there's 170,000 Africans in Washington, D.C., and they're diplomats, they are lawyers, they are doctors. These are upper middle class people who want to eat locally grown African food. They don't want to fly it in. They want to eat it. So the Bowlings contacted some members of the African community and the University of Maryland Extension Service and found out through the University of Maryland Extension, there's actually quite a lot of African crops that will grow in the Maryland terroir, the combination of soil and climate. And now the sign outside the Bowling farm says African produce. And there's a lot of farms in Maryland now selling African produce. What are local foods? A lot of the alternative food movement, the acolytes of Michael Pollan, will be pulling their hair out, if they had any. They'd be pulling their hair out at that very idea that African crops were being considered local foods. But here's the point. Look, I'm a geographer. I don't know how many of you are. There is no such thing as local. There's no geographic thing as local. It's whatever we decide it is. But clearly what immigrants do is bring with them their own local. And that includes the Filipinos in San Diego. Now, the Filipinos in San Diego, when interviewed by a PhD candidate about local food, they said, well, it's the food we grow in our yards, it's the food we eat. They invoked the concept of translocalism. Immigrants bring with them their own local, whether it's the Africans in DC, or it's the Guatemalans in Boston, sitting by the willows. So you see this importance of connection, of belonging is really, really important. And so my argument here is that the very white, upper middle class alternative food movement needs to be much more reflexive in understanding of what local is and what it means. And, I'm going to give you an example from your own country. What percentage of farmers in the Greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians? Somebody throw out a figure. 20%. 20%. And you know what that means in England, don't you? When you did that, you know what that, yeah, you should, yeah, do that. I was thinking, well, geez, what the, so, taken aback a little there. 20% of farmers in the Greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. And you can see there the house. I mean, that causes all kinds of planners because, that breaks the rules. But that, again, that's a whole nother story. The reason I'm saying this is these Chinese Canadian farmers don't use the usual, largely white middle-class farmers markets. They've set up their own network of farmers markets. And I gave this talk in Vancouver, and a young East African woman came up to me and she said, I'm so glad you said that. I shop at the Chinese farmers markets because they sell more of the products that I want. Now, I'm not saying anybody's right or wrong here. This is just what's happening. So we've got these parallel local food networks. So the two big things that the alternative food movement really push is buy fresh, buy local, and shop at farmers markets. And both are being challenged. The farmers markets by the Chinese Canadians in the Greater Vancouver region, and the local challenges by the Filipinos, by the Africans, by so many more different communities. In the Boston area, we've got gardens now that are being, food's being grown for local homes, etc. Very diverse kind of spaces. Another take on this notion of localism. This is the sad story of South Central Farm in LA. This was the biggest urban farm in the United States. It was 96% farmers, Latinx farmers. And this story that the Zapotec woman is talking about, it just, again, it makes the hairs stand up on my neck. She said, I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. I grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to be a part of who we are after coming to the United States. And if you look at that garden there, I mean, there's the obligatory, global northern chain link fence, but then there's the prickly pear cactuses that form the field boundaries where she's from. The food isn't just culturally appropriate, it's grown in the same ways. So I think the anthropologists they did in the book the Cultivating Food Justice book, autotopography, the inscription of one's culture and identity on the urban landscape. But what this is, in urban planning terms, is placemaking through food. We also have in the United States a network of about 50 and growing community farms, and this is New Roots in San Diego, where these are intercultural learning centers. We've got one that is run by Tufts University in Lowell, Massachusetts. And these are places where new immigrants can come and learn about farming and, learn with local farmers, but also teach local farmers what they consider to be, cultivation and agriculture. So these are intercultural learning spaces, places where contact theory can happen. Now, I don't need to leave this book on for 45 seconds because this is open access. If you're interested, this is my second to last book. It's The Immigrant Food Nexus, Labor and Identity in North America. And there's a really interesting chapter actually about Canadian farming and how the white Canadian farmer, is constructed in news media reports. And so, if you're interested, do take a look at that. But the book really takes this look at the US, but this idea that food policy, immigration policy and food policy are very interlinked, and they are in Canada as well. Who grows the food? But the part of the book that I'm more interested in actually is the bit where we look at the micro level. What are the daily spatial practices of different groups in terms of food procurement? I'm going to finish with just a couple of quick slides. Somebody talked about governance. I want to talk about leadership as a special aspect of governance. And again, Mayor Wu, I think, is amazing in this. My students and I and various other groups in Boston have an input to her food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. Show me another politician that has a food, that even talks about food justice, but has a food justice agenda for a resilient city. Lots of nonprofits, you can get your People's Plan for this and People's Plan for that. But this is a politician, albeit when she was candidate Wu. But look how she starts her policy. Food justice means racial justice, demanding a clear-eyed understanding of how white supremacy has shaped our food systems nationally and right here in Boston, where Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and AAPI communities have not enjoyed equal access to nutritious and culturally relevant foods. A really big point, often in sustainability thinking, in climate thinking, we think about getting the job done, and if equity and social justice is increased as a result, that's a good thing. That doesn't work anymore. We need to center equity and social justice in that pot of demands that we have. They need to be in the center. In other words, what I'm saying is we don't get social justice. We have to start with social justice. If any of you were Twitterers, that would be such a good tweet. I don't see anybody tweeting these days. Maya, tweet it. Come on. Okay, quick summary. Just sustainabilities. We need to manage coexistence in shared space, these very powerful concepts, sharing and coexistence. We need to foster belonging as well as dreaming about what our cities can become. But we need a bigger community for thinking about what cities can become. And that only happens with increasing belonging. We need to foster engagement and belonging using deep ethnographies. Ethnographic data has its place, but it's limited. It's not enough. We need deep ethnographic understandings. We need to engage intercultural, culturally competent, or we need to exercise cultural humility, I think I should say there. We need to practice humane-scaled and human-scaled urban planning and design, and above all, again, driving it home, social justice never happens in planning processes and outcomes. It must be intentional, explicit, upfront, and centered in our work. Thank you.
But don't worry.
Oh, okay.